All right, we'll get started. Let me open us in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together to report on what's going on in our denomination. I pray that you bless our conversation and may you strengthen our denomination and strengthen our church as a part of it. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so I think everyone knows me. I don't see any faces I don't recognize. So anyway, I'm Caleb Standifer. For anybody watching online, I'm a ruling elder here at Redeeming Grace. And today we're going to be a little bit different than normal Sunday school. Some of you may not be aware, but as a part of our denominational governing documents, which is called the Book of Church Order, this is going to be a little bit of a nerdy session, but the elders are actually required to give a report on General Assembly every year to the congregation. And that's because the PCA is what is called a grassroots denomination. So that is different than something like the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, right? Where they are a top-down denomination. They've got authority at the top, and that flows down to all the congregations. We're a grassroots denomination, so it's really, think about it, it's very similar actually to our country. A lot of these ideas were developed by the same Scottish Presbyterians. And so it's really that the members of the churches are where it starts. And the members of the churches elect elders, and then the elders, and they call pastors to themselves, so the teaching elders and the ruling elders. And then those men function at presbytery together, which I think most of you know, but for those of you who don't, we have a local group of churches here that is within a certain geographic area that's called a presbytery. And they govern the churches within the area, adjudicate issues, talk about different things. So that's what happens there. And then at the top level, there's General Assembly. And that's kind of like our Congress. It functions a little bit differently because what happens at General Assembly is all the teaching elders in the denomination get to be representatives there. No matter how small the church is, all the teaching elders get to go and have a vote. And then there's a minimum of every church is guaranteed at least 2 ruling elders that they can send. A lot of churches don't send their ruling elders, either because they're not interested in doing it or because they don't have ruling elders who are able or willing to take the time to go and participate in up to a week-long event. And we'll talk a little bit about that at some point. There's some discussion about that in the denomination. But then what happens is we vote on issues within the church. We vote on theological issues that are things that are, what do we believe that the Bible says about certain things? And how will that work itself out within our churches? And then there's also practical issues. There's governance issues. There's finance issues. There's all sorts of different things that get debated and talked about. And that's where the business of the church is done. But then, when General Assembly passes many things, without boring you with all the details, that has to go back down to the presbyteries to approve. So there are checks and balances there. So this is all a big part of our denominational governance, but General Assembly is kind of the focus point of those issues for the year. There's a lot of chatter. I know some of you follow certain personalities on YouTube or on blogs online who talk about these issues and talk about what's going on with them, and it really starts to ramp up around General Assembly. So this year, General Assembly was in Louisville, Kentucky. Oh, and let me just finish by saying, so part of that is when you all send us to General Assembly, our governing documents say it's important for you to know what happened there. what we did and what happened. So we are required to do that, and we're actually required to put in the minutes of the session for the year that we gave that report. I chair the Nominations and Sessional Records Committee at our presbytery, and one of the things that we do is go through and we check to see if the church actually did that. And if they didn't, there's a formal citation to that church that says, hey, you didn't do something you're required to do. Please do that in the future. So that's part of our whole checks and balances within the denomination. And I'm thankful to be in a denomination that has those things. Some of them may seem pretty simple, mundane, like why do we have to have a clerical note about this? But it's really so that it's really care for the people and a reminder that in the church, since we don't have top-down authority, we really need to provide that information because we're accountable to you all, right? So that's this. So I'm going to go through a bunch of things pretty quick. I also want to answer questions because I know there may be a lot of questions. This year, Miguel went, Tim went to observe, and then Gordon went as well. So Miguel, Gordon, and I were the voting members, and we were there. We also had a junior delegate. Boyd sat with me for most of the time of the sessions, which was really sweet. I think, just as an aside, you should be encouraged about the health of our denomination because of some of the younger pastors in it. There were 4 young pastors in their 30s who I got to know last year after I gave a speech at GA. Wonderful, faithful, confessional, just very engaging men. One of whom is an associate pastor at the church that Richie, Henry and Gretchen's son-in-law, went to when he was in pilot training up in New Jersey, which was a fun connection last year. But these young men they're very active, very connected within the denomination, very much support the things that our church would support within the denomination. But they turned around and were engaging Boyd, talking with him. When he asked a question, they would turn around and explain the nuances of what was going on with Robert's Rules of Order or the theological issues. It was very touching to me as a father, but also as a member of our church. It was encouraging because there have been some things that many of you are aware of over the past 10 years within our denomination where there was real concern about which way is our denomination going to go. And sometimes the people who are very strident in a faithful biblical direction can frankly be a little cold sometimes and not very pastoral. And it's just very encouraging to me to see these young pastors who are very engaged, very faithful, but very pastoral and would take the time to invest in a young man who's there, even as they're very involved in the business of the church. So I think that that's a very personal note about something we should be encouraged about. But anyway, so it was in Louisville, Kentucky. The basic structure is it runs Monday through Thursday with Friday available for overflow. Now, what happened a few years ago, GA was known for going late into the night on Thursday night, sometimes even into Friday morning. There's been an encouraging trend over the past year where they kind of cut the fat of the assembly. And what I mean by that is there were lots of things that had crept into the agenda that were nice to have, but non-essential. They weren't really the business of the church. They were reports. They used to have 10 other churches give fraternal reports to us and things like that, which those are great to hear from sister churches like denominations like the OPC or the RPCNA. It's great. But what it was doing was pushing us to 2 a.m. on Thursday or even having to come back on Friday. So they took a lot of those things and cut them out. So the past couple years, we've gotten done Thursday evening at a very reasonable time, which is encouraging because we're focusing on the important business first. Now, there's some improvement we need to make there, but that's what we do. And then, so that's Wednesday and Thursday is when all 2,000 or so of the delegates who are there, the voting members, the commissioners, meet. and they go through a very detailed agenda there. The first 2 days, so I got there Monday morning, because the first 2 days are what are called Committee of Commissioners. And what that is there's agencies in the PCA, which many of you are aware of, MTW, MNA, our administrative committee, which kind of helps coordinate among the presbyteries. It's very useful. All of these places have a permanent committee, which is elected by the assembly that governs them. It's somewhat like a board of directors, a little bit different, but you can think about it like that. And those men meet throughout the year, and they govern the agency, the management of the agency. But then there's another check where every presbytery appoints someone to be on the Committee of Commissioners, which then we have to ratify certain things that the permanent committee did and recommend them to the assembly to pass. So those would be things like the budgets of those committees. It would be some major actions that they want to take. We have to say whether we recommend that they take that action or not. The reappointment of the head of that agency, so our agency heads only serve for 1-year terms. That became a point of, there was an overture about that this year, which we'll get to, possibly. There were over 80 overtures this year, which was a record, so not everything was gotten to. And then they also we can ask questions, right? We can ask questions of the agency to hold them accountable. So I was on admin committee this year. What has happened, I think, in our denomination, and this is more broad and plays into one of the major things that happened this year, is that our denomination started out with a group of men back in the 70s who were very concerned about what was going on in the Presbyterian Church, right? And back then it was mainly about the ordination of women, though it was also about the inerrancy of Scripture and several different concerns. And so those men met together at Briarwood Presbyterian Church down in Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, and they split from that denomination and formed the PCA. Some of them left behind their retirement savings. Churches left behind their property because it was owned by the denomination. That's one reason why every PCA church owns their own property today, because we believe that the local congregation should not be held hostage by that. And we have churches that leave the PCA and come into it every year, and they're free to do that. But you can see our church was involved in that. You can see in the narthex that there are signers of that document, and there are, I believe, members of our church who are on that document. So our church was involved in that. But back then it was a small denomination, it was very southern, and these men all knew each other. So there was this attitude of, which was workable back then, these are good men, we trust them, right? And so they kind of just let things run, and things ran well. Well, the PCA, God has blessed it. It has grown tremendously. Very, very large. It's one of the fastest growing evangelical denominations certainly the fastest growing, I would say, Presbyterian denomination. And what that's caused is we have not only a much larger denomination that stretches across the country with thousands of churches, but we also, and how many presbyteries? We just added a new presbytery. We split the Eastern Tennessee Presbytery, but we've got over 80 presbyteries. And so it's big and complex. And many of these agencies have budgets that are tens of millions of dollars a year. And so what I would say is we're kind of in our late teenage years where there's a struggle within the denomination, and this is a pet interest of mine that doesn't get as much press in some of the online things because it's mostly pastors talking about that, and They're not as much administrative nerds as I am typically. They focus more on the theology, which is fantastic. But basically, we're trying to get into what does it look like when we all don't know each other anymore, right? And these agencies are big. What is wise governance? And I would say we're in the middle innings of a shift from a philosophy of trust until there's firm evidence of wrongdoing, and then you can ask questions and jump on it, to we need to ask good questions of these agency heads and our denominational governance all the way along as a form of accountability to prevent things from going wrong, to prevent things from going off the rails, and just constantly have that pressure there for wise stewardship. And so that's a point of contention, because there really is a feeling among some in the PCA that if you ask questions, you're causing problems, right? And I've dealt with that personally. Well, one of the big issues this year that I'll start with is Mission to North America. Many of you are aware last year I made some speeches about their budget and their financials, and there was something that seemed to be off there. Didn't know what it was, but could see that in the numbers, and so could some other people who didn't necessarily give speeches. Some other people gave some speeches to similar effect. And what happened over the past year is it ended up, for an unrelated scandal, the head of that agency resigned and was replaced on an interim basis by a man that Henry knows, a ruling elder, Steve Dowling, who's a businessman, a Marine, and wonderful man. He's been going through that agency over the past year. Well, what happened last year was we were told, this is an example of what I'm saying, why are you asking questions? The head of the agency is a good man, these are good people. Are you accusing them of doing something wrong? And we said, no, we don't know. We're just saying something's off here. We need to ask some questions and get some answers here. Well, what turned out happening is that there were a bunch of issues with M&A. And to his credit, Steve gave probably the best report I've ever heard at General Assembly. He went first off, he gave a written report which was vetted by the attorneys that they have working with them on the issues at M&A. And he went through, and the investigation's not done, so he could only share so much, but it was very transparent about what was going on, and I'll give you what was going on in a minute. But then in his speech, he was very clear. He gave numbers about what was going on with the budget. It was not a bunch of hand-waving about, oh, everything's going to church planting. It was very specific, right, and very credible. And then he talked about financial controls and governance things that they're putting in place, like if you want to deviate from your budget over a certain amount, you have a form you have to submit. And based on the amount of that deviation, you have to get approval to do that. Now, those of you who work in corporate are probably like, duh, that just makes sense, right? But these are the sort of simple things I'm talking about, that this attitude of well, these are good people, which they are, has led to. And what that led to, among other things in M&A, is it led to salary inflation of certain members. So what they've done is they've frozen. They don't want to cut people, but what they've done is they've frozen until cost of living and inflation will normalize those salaries, which I think is a wise thing to do. They've put in certain controls about certain spending. They've instituted budgeting procedures where people have to say, hey, here are my goals for this year, and my plan and the money I need to spend is tied to achieving that goal. And that's how that budgeting process will work. Again, these are very basic, standard things. But the big thing was that they found, and we don't know the full story yet, but disaster relief, many of you may have given to in M&A. And so there's a ministry that when there's a hurricane or something like Western North Carolina, you can give to M&A disaster relief, and they will deploy resources to help with the physical needs, and as a part of that, share the gospel, right? Which is a great thing to do. Well, what ended up happening was, and it's fairly technical, but the donor funds that were solicited for that under saying 100% of those funds will go to disaster relief. But what they found is that actually they were skimming off part of those funds to help with administrative expenses of the agency. Now, you might, this gets a little bit technical, but I want to be transparent about it because it's gotten a lot of press. What happened is that is actually a thing that you can do as an agency. There are many nonprofits that do that say 5% of your donation is going to go to administrative expenses, because those are real, right? And then the rest of it will go to disaster relief. What you cannot do is tell people that 100% is going there and then not do that, right? So that became a big issue, and they're still trying to work that out. And they're committed to making it right, but they have to figure out with the attorneys what does it mean to make that right, right? But part of that then goes back to their accounting practices, right? They were not doing donor funds accounting, and their audit did not, that they go through with a CPA firm, did not look into that. So again, I'm probably boring some of you. My wife's giving me looks. But there is, the whole point being, there's very basic things that I think our denomination needs to implement. And what this M&A situation, the head of disaster relief was actually dismissed, because it also came out that he was taking some funds from general funds to gross up his own personal fundraising. And so a bunch of different things. I think on the back end of this, the point is that there's a lot of good people in M&A who are doing fantastic work. We're planning great churches. The disaster relief is a great organization. But there were these governance issues that just had caused, I wouldn't call them massive problems of people doing things intentionally wrong. But I think there was a lot of ignorance about what the right thing to do was, because nobody was asking the questions, right? And there was this attitude of just trust. So that came down, and that's being cleaned up, and I'm very grateful. You can pray for Steve. He's doing fantastic work, and I think I know some of the members of the permanent committee as well, and they're on top of this, and so you can just pray for that, and also pray for their search for the next permanent head of M&A, because that search is underway now for that man. So that's something that's going on, and part of what I did then on the administrative committee, because we approve all the budgets, is I started asking questions about the other agencies, and that led to some blowback and some conversations that I had to have. But I think we need to go through this, because ultimately we're accountable to you all who are giving money to these agencies to make sure that they are being used wisely and as intended, right? And so that's a very nerdy kind of administrative thing that's going on with our denomination. But I'm encouraged. There's progress being made there, and that's a wonderful thing. So the other big thing about GA is, like I said, there are overtures that are brought for those who are unfamiliar, and those are changes that we want to make to the denomination. So broadly speaking, those can be things like we want to change our rules, or we want to change what we say we believe, or clarify what we say we believe, or there's something called study committees where it says we don't know what we think about a certain issue as a denomination, so we want to have a study committee go out, a group of men who have some sort of expertise and experience in that area and study that, and then come back to the denomination with a report about saying this is what we think we should believe about that, and then we can adopt that report. And those things become very helpful to the denomination because they can clarify things. So there were a couple study committees that were not finished. They were established last year, but they were not finished this year, but they presented interim reports. One was on Christian nationalism. So many of you have heard about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is a broad title. There's a variety of people. There's a friend of Henry's that I met at GA who would call himself a Christian nationalist, but he's very much thinks that is a return to the founding when, like as Henry was talking about a few weeks ago in his sermon, you know, there were references to God in public schools, in primers that were read. There was this idea that we're one nation under God, and also a view on who that God is the Judeo-Christian God, right? And so there's that end, but then there's a lot of valid concern because there's another end where there's something called kinism, and kinism is that it's basically racism. And it's people saying that a nation should be an ethno-state, right? And we would reject that very strongly. There's an ARP pastor nearby over in Clover who has written very strongly on this and very well. And I think he's done a good job. So this study report was supposed to kind of untangle that and make a clear statement. They've started to do that. And that report is available if anybody wants to read it, the interim report. But what they're doing is they're now seeking feedback on that because some of the definitional, as I said, because it's such a broad statement, they want to get feedback so that then they can clarify some of these things and these distinctions better to say, what is in bounds from historic confessional Christianity and Presbyterianism, and what is out of bounds, right? What is unbiblical? And that's basically what they're doing. So we got that report. It was expected that there would be a lot of discussion about that. It was not that controversial, and we voted to extend their work another year to allow them to finish that. The other study committee is on our directory of worship. So in our book of church order, we have a directory of worship that basically says the guidelines about what is permissible in worship in our denomination and what is not. Now, our the directory of worship in something like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which is one of our sister denominations, is binding, which means that churches can be held to account on whether they follow it or not. The PCA's directory of worship is not binding, and there are people in the denomination who are concerned about that. Because of that, there is a vast difference, there can be a vast difference in what worship looks like in PCA churches. And what we want to do is, there still will be a spectrum within the denomination, but what people are concerned about is they're saying we want to narrow that a little bit. And because we want, if one of you was to go across the country and visit a PCA church, there should be some expectation of what you're walking into, right? It's something, it's denominational credibility in a sense. And so there's a study committee that's going on that's defining that and rewriting our directory of worship in preparation for a vote to make it binding. So that was not finished, but we got an interim report on that. So that was one of the major things. And then there was a very controversial vote about establishing a study committee on AI. And that's where study committees can go a little bit funny. Some people are interested in something. There were some good points that were brought up that we don't even know what AI is going to do. Like how can we have a study committee on it, how it affects the church? But it passed, I think, because there's a lot of anxiety and questions about AI. And so we'll see what happens there. We do not know who is on that study committee yet. We frankly don't even know what tack they're going to take on it. But that will be interesting to see what they write. The other big thing that was really a major issue coming into it was there were a ton of those over 80 overtures that were around a controversy around can there be female deacons? So there are churches within our denomination that believe that the office of deacon is one that men and women can hold. And there's a lot of churches like ours that believe, no, that is not what Scripture says. And so that's something where there were overtures both on the side of trying to say, yes, there can be female deacons, and not to force churches that don't have them to have them, but just to allow that to be a practice within the church. And there were also overtures from other churches trying to further clarify that these offices can only be held by men. And then there's a kind of another layer to this, where there are some PCA churches that have established a quasi-office called shepherdess. And basically, the fundamental thinking underneath it and argument is that men cannot shepherd women, so we need, as well as women can, so we need to have women who are able to do that, ignoring a bunch of different things about, and maybe Henry can speak to this if there are questions, but ignoring things about elders' wives and different things there, but establishing that as an office within there. And there are people who are concerned about that because there are even folks who have had these shepherdesses basically become quasi-members of the session, right? And so it's becoming incrementally more and more of a problem that gets us to an egalitarian view versus a complementarian view, which is the scriptural view. And so there were a lot of different things. What ultimately happened is the Overtures Committee, which takes all these things, you can't have a debate with 2,000 people about the wording of these things. So what happens is they go to an Overtures Committee, which again, we have members of our presbytery on that, and they vote, they go through these overtures and then they revise them, they revise the wording. They'll take like 13 of them that address the same thing, and they'll say, what's the best one? And then say, we're gonna answer all of those with reference to this one. And then they put a proposal to the General Assembly that gets debated. And the General Assembly cannot override their proposal. They can only vote to accept their proposal or reject it, right? And that's part of, it's kind of like in Congress how bills get worked out in a committee first, for those of you who are familiar with that process, and then get voted on by the whole body. Very similar to that. And so what they did is they basically took one overture that said that they took one of those overtures, they had all of them for and against reference to that overture, and then they recommended that we reject it because our governing documents are already sufficient to answer the question. That got approved, but it left people on both sides feeling a bit unsatisfied, like there wasn't the clarity on this issue given that was necessary. And so I expect that in future years, we'll see more of these overtures sent up, and the General Assembly will be forced to clarify this issue. And so it's an interesting, and by the way, one of the reasons why this is important is that back in, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s, there was a denomination that wanted to join the PCA, and they came in. The PCA had never had female deacons. This denomination did. And they said, yes, you can join, but one of the conditions is that you adopt our view of the diaconate. Well, that view was never enforced. So a lot of these churches that believe this came from that denomination or have a heritage coming from that denomination. And so if you ask, why is it important to have clarity on these issues within the denomination and to be clear and firm about them? Part of it is because 30 years later, we're dealing with the fallout of failing to have that clarity up front and enforcing that clarity. And it doesn't mean that we couldn't be in good fraternal relations with a denomination. Like, I believe the ARP still allows female deacons. And we have good relations with them as a denomination. But a denomination has to have a view on important issues. And it has to be consistent internally on that view. And so that's an example of how we're now having a very robust discussion about something that is an issue from 30 years ago that we should have clarified then, and it's coming back around. And it's going to be harder to deal with this time because of where we're at in that issue. So those were some of the major things that happened at GA. I'll open it up for questions in a minute, but Gordon, Tim, Miguel, did I miss anything major? Is there anything? Do you want me to talk about anything with MTW, Miguel? Okay. There's a lot more nerdy stuff we could talk about, but what questions do you have about the process, about any issues that are going on? Did I miss any major issue, Henry? One thing I will add. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction with our last what's called stated clerk. So our stated clerk he runs the administrative committee. And what the administrative committee does is they do a bunch of things like statistics. They also publish compensation surveys. They do a bunch of just rather mundane stuff, but things that are very helpful to us. They also employ somebody who's an expert on these governing documents and the cases that have been tried about them. And Ryan and I actually submitted a complaint to Presbytery. Henry signed it earlier this year, and we got help from the gentleman at the AC who is the expert on this. And so the AC is very helpful. It also runs the General Assembly. And the man who they found to replace the former gentleman who resigned, there was a controversy there a couple years ago, is a man named Fred Greco, a pastor from Houston, and he was a lawyer before he entered the pastorate, and he's a wonderful man, very confessional, and he will do, we believe, an excellent job, and he got voted in unanimously. And so I think that that's another reason to be encouraged by the changes in our denomination, because he's somebody who's biblically faithful, not flashy, not a showboat at all, but biblically faithful, hardworking, but also cares about some of these more mundane governance things that I think it will really help. But he's got broad respect in the denomination, even from people who disagree with him. And I think that it will be very healthy, and a lot of people are very encouraged that he's going to be the stated clerk. So there's great reasons to be encouraged about the PCA. I don't think 10 years ago we would have been in the same spot, but there was a lot of chatter about how God has really blessed our denomination and blessed the prayers of many of you who, whether it was the Revoice controversy or other things years ago, have been praying for our denomination. And you see how God is blessing that and really pulling us back into even more biblical faithfulness. Not that we ever fully left, but some of those things are being clearly cut out, and we are becoming a stronger denomination because of it. So to God be the glory. Betty? So I don't recall the exact number. It's around there. There's one church called McCutcheon Memorial that's way out in the country that is it's declining, and so we're unsure about that. You can be in prayer about for McCutcheon and what we do with that church out there. But on the flip side, then there's a church plant in Indian Land that is underway, and we're actively. Some of you may recall that I initiated a discussion about our presbytery budget, and we're actually starting to reallocate some funds from giving outside our presbytery into looking at how do we plant more churches, because we are in one of the fastest growing areas in the nation, and one of the top priorities for M&A to do church planting. So we're praying about how does our presbytery financially support that. There will probably be an ask to the churches at some point, and then the missions committee of the presbytery is starting to look at what would that look like, where would we want to plant a church, how do we get men who are willing to plant those churches, and so that work is starting. All right, Mary. Yeah. Well, there's a biblical term for that, right? When Paul says in Titus that the older men are supposed to disciple the younger, the older women are supposed to disciple the younger. Some of you have heard my high horse on this, that I think that that's something that the church needs more of and needs to get back to, is that discipleship. The word for that biblically is just discipleship, right? It doesn't require an office. It's a command to all Christians, right? Whoever they are, to do that. And that is, but I think, and I agree, there is yeah. Yes. One 100%, and thank you for allowing me to clarify. This is not saying that there is not a discipling aspect that the church body undergoes. That's one of the arguments, is that Titus already lays out how we're supposed to do this, right? And there is value in same-sex, same-gender discipling relationships, right? Those are important, and we'd even say that they would be inappropriate in certain senses if they were done men to women, women to men, right? That would be inappropriate. But I think that the flip side of that too is that there's also been a movement where that's happened, to where the elders abdicate their responsibility. So they are no longer shepherding like they're supposed to, right? We're called to shepherd the flock, and that's work that we're supposed to do. And there's wisdom that's required and a longer discussion there, but that's the office, right? But discipleship is something that every Christian's called to do. True. Very true. Yeah. Discipleship is not the province of, like, certainly officers are supposed to disciple, but we're supposed to disciple because every Christian's supposed to disciple. As you grow in maturity, you find somebody who's earlier in their faith than you are, and you disciple them, right? That is what every Christian's called to do. And so some of this comes from just a failure to go through, like, what does this really mean, and what does the office really hold itself to? And you're right, some churches have adopted a view, well, discipleship is what the officers should be doing. And that's not what a healthy church does. That's not what a biblical church does. A biblical church has a culture of discipleship where everyone is involved in that, right? And that's a wonderful, beautiful thing, right? What else? Rick? Are you saying me or like you as a member? So yeah. So I mean, this get our records are public, right? The minutes of this are public, as well as the minutes of General Assembly are public, the financials of the presbytery, the of any denominational agency of our church are public. And that includes in, like, for instance, if there are citations based off of things that are not in the minutes or things, those records are all public. The things that are not public would be things that are in executive session. Those would be sensitive matters of like trials for sensitive sins where we want to protect the innocent, or things where we don't know the verdict yet. So there's certain things that should be kept a little bit more confidential, but we are very careful about that, and there's actually checks and balances even on that. But that's one thing that you can do if you're interested. You can request the records of any of these bodies, and you can look at them and you can ask questions, right? This is all open. Again, General Assembly is presbytery. Our session meetings, they're all open meetings. Anybody is welcome to attend. Like, nobody said anything to me about Boyd walking in and sitting in there, because it's an open meeting. Anybody, frankly, at General Assembly, it's supposed to be any member can go in, but yeah. Yeah, so the first thing is, if we think that there's something wrong, as Ryan said, that's something we can't bring charges on within our judicial system, then we make a rule about it. That's the first step. But the other aspect is, if there is a rule, there are different ways that you can bring accusations, and then it's tried by a court. So I'll use Revoice because that was, for those of you who know about that controversy in the past, there was a church in St. Louis that was doing some things that were scripturally out of bounds. And what happened there is they were tried at the presbytery. The presbytery said, no, it's fine. But the churches said, no, the denomination, a lot of the folks there said, no, this presbytery is wrong. So what happens then is other presbyteries and churches can bring charges against that presbytery, saying that we believe that that's wrong. And then that decision gets adjudicated and reviewed. And this can take a long, long time. And some people outside our denomination, and I say this because some of you may listen to voices that are outside our denomination, there were a lot of voices at that time that said, well, the PCA's going off the rails. They're done, right? But they didn't understand our process. And sometimes that process can take years to work out. And that can be frustrating when there's an issue of accountability that we think is legitimate and we want to see that happen. But the benefit of that is that, just like sometimes it's a benefit for Congress to move slowly, there's benefits for us to move slowly and considered, because that means we make changes slowly. And that also means we can't radicalize the denomination as quickly. It gives us time to investigate these things. And so, but yes, there are checks and balances, and even if a certain court makes a decision, there are ways, like our presbytery could vote to then bring charges against another presbytery and say they're wrong, and then that would get adjudicated at the General Assembly level. So they can, we can go back to things like suspending from the sacraments, right?